This module will focus on the requirements for placement decisions for students with disabilities. Topics covered will include least restrictive environment, or LRE, consideration of harmful effects, continuum of services, manifestation determination, and interim alternative educational settings. Federal law defines least restrictive environment as to the maximum extent appropriate, children with disabilities, including children in public and private institutions or other care facilities, are educated with children who are not disabled, and special classes, separate schooling, or other removal of children with disabilities from the regular educational environment occurs only when the nature or severity of the disability of a child is such that education in regular classes with the use of supplementary aids and services cannot be achieved satisfactorily. So the law is clear that students with disabilities should be educated with peers who are not disabled to the maximum extent appropriate. The continuum of services is in place for all students with disabilities, and all placement decisions are made by the ARC. The general education setting should always be considered first for every student, regardless of the disability. There are 4 rules to consider least restrictive environment. First, consider the regular education classroom for every student. Second, consider as possible adaptations, aids, and services in regular education classrooms. Third, consider special education class or resource room for part of the day before considering special class full day. And fourth, consider a more restrictive placement, if appropriate, and those options being special schools, home instruction, hospitals, or institutions. The ARC must consider and document on the conference summary why each placement decision was made. For example, why can't this child's goal in reading be implemented in the regular education setting? And why the decision to implement in the chosen place is appropriate for the child. This slide provides a pictorial representation of location and placement considerations as an example of Infinite Campus. Additional guidance for LRE can be found in the Kentucky Guidance Document for IEP Development. The ARC reviews the present levels, student performance data, and services identified on the IEP to determine the location of service provision. The student's disability does not determine the LRE placement of the student. All ARC decisions, including placement, must be based on data. The ARC must use documented information in the IEP to make the placement decision. The continuum of services must be kept in mind. All children have a right to continuum of services and placements to meet their individual needs. The majority of students are served in the regular classroom for all or part of the school day. The ARC will consider what is the least restrictive environment for the child based on the child's IEP. Remember, the least restrictive environment is not the same for every child. The key questions in determining the least restrictive environment are: what does the IEP say the child needs? Where can the child receive what the IEP says he or she needs? Where can the child receive what the IEP says and be with other children who do not have educational disabilities? The ARC must always consider regular education settings and a regular school as the first option for placement. Where the child receives services depends on the kind of support the child needs. The school district must obtain written permission or consent from the parent or guardian before the child receives the IEP services. The decision as to where the IEP will be implemented, how it will be monitored, reviewed, revised, how and when progress will be reported to parents, is all documented on the IEP. If the decision can't be fully documented on the IEP itself, you should sufficiently cover it on the conference summary. Remember, the IEP is the child's program, which the ARC is legally responsible to see that it's provided as written. Placement is where the student will receive special education and related services. Decisions must be made in conformity with the standard of least restrictive environment, and IDEA's strong preference is that, to the maximum extent appropriate, students are educated in the regular setting with non-disabled peers. Sometimes the ARC may identify potential harmful effects of a placement, such as placing the student in a special class or a student transitioning from a hospital setting to a public school. Take a moment to consider what other potential harmful effects may be. To support considerations for general education, this slide includes links to documents that may inform you in your LRE guidance. The LRE guidelines in the federal regulations and a letter to Tom Trigg that's maintained on the Department of Education's Office of Special Education Programming websites are included in this page. Here's an example of a consideration of potential harmful effects statement. It reads, Jessica's emotional and behavioral disability requires placement in a special class because her extreme level of anxiety is often triggered by large groups and non-structured settings. She will have opportunities to participate in field trips and school-based community activities to compensate for separate instruction from non-disabled peers. Consideration of potential harmful effects is not only just for full-time special education students. It can also be considered for resource and students receiving co-teaching services. Here's another example of documenting potential harmful effect. Jackson is returning mid-year from a 12-week day treatment program to a large comprehensive high school where he'll participate in 2 resource classes, English 2 and Geometry, and regular classes for electives, history, and chemistry. Change and forming relationships are difficult for Jackson. To support transition to a new school and new trimester, the special education teacher and Jackson will meet with each teacher, the general education and special education teachers, to review his IEP and behavior intervention plan. During the trimester, if needed, Jackson will use a green pass to go to the special education teacher's classroom or counselor's office for consultation. Students with disabilities removed from current placement for separate incidences cannot amount to more than 10 school days. This includes incidences such as suspensions. Kentucky Administrative Regulation states school personnel may remove a student with a disability who violates the code of conduct from the student's placement to an appropriate interim alternative education setting, another setting, or suspension for not more than 10 consecutive school days. Certain protections are in place for students with disabilities once the 11th day has occurred. On the 11th day, regulations consider the suspension or the removal as a change of placement, and it's determined on a case-by-case basis. No later than this time, ARCs must consider and conduct a manifestation determination. In addition, the student must still continue to receive a free, appropriate public education. Regulations read, within 10 days of any decision to change the placement of a child with a disability because of a violation of a code of student conduct, the conduct caused by or have a direct and substantial relationship to the disability, and The manifestation helps determine whether the conduct was the direct result of the LEA failing to implement the individual education plan. Links to resources that you may find helpful are included on this slide. On the date the decision was made to make a removal that constitutes a change in placement over 10 days, it's imperative that you contact the parent, give them a copy of the procedural safeguards, and then, not later than 10 days, conduct the manifestation determination. During a manifestation determination, it's important that our chairperson ensures that everyone has a copy of the IEP and, if appropriate, the Behavior Intervention Plan, or BIP, and follow it. This is for all students with a disability, not just students with an emotional behavior disability or other health impairment. If the ARC determines the behavior was a manifestation of a disability, there are 3 incidences that have to take place. You must conduct a functional behavior assessment unless previously conducted and develop a BIP, or Behavior Intervention Plan. You must review the Behavior Intervention Plan if one has already been developed and modify it as necessary. And third, return the student to the placement from which the student was removed unless the parent and district agree to the change of placement. It's imperative to know your district's policies and procedures regarding conducting a manifestation determination meeting and taking disciplinary actions for students with disabilities. Interim alternative educational settings. There are instances in which school personnel order the removal of children with disabilities from their current educational placement to an appropriate interim alternative educational setting for no more than 45 school days. In this definition, school personnel does not mean the ARC. The ARC is responsible for determining the interim alternative educational setting. This is applicable for students with disabilities who 1. Possess a weapon on school premises, 2. Use or sell illegal drugs, and 3. Inflict serious bodily injury upon another person. Interim alternative educational settings can be done whether the behavior is a manifestation of their disability or not. Interim alternative educational settings assure that a student may continue to progress in the general curriculum. It also ensures that students with disabilities receive their IEP services, and the placement includes services to address behavior and prevent behavior from reoccurring. Related services. Transportation and developmental, supportive, or corrective services which are needed by a student with a disability to benefit from special education are related services. Special transportation is considered a related service, and it's to be documented in the IEP the same way as other related services. Under IDEA, the local education agency provides non-academic and extracurricular services and activities so that children with disabilities have an equal opportunity for participation in those services and activities. In arranging for the non-academic and extracurricular services and activities, including transportation, the LEA must make sure that the child with disabilities participates with children who do not have disabilities to the maximum extent appropriate to the needs of the child with disabilities. Just as other placement decisions, the decision to place a student on special transportation must be determined through an analysis of data, a review of the IEP and behavior plan, including revisions to specially designed instruction, supplementary aids and services, and program modifications. This must occur prior to determining the student needs for special transportation. Transfer students. If a child with a disability transfers between school districts within the same academic year within Kentucky and had an IEP in effect, then the child shall be provided a free and appropriate public education, including services comparable to those described in the previous IEP. These services shall be provided in consultation with the parents and until the LEA adopts the previous IEP or develops and implements a new IEP. Comparable means the services provided will be as close as possible to those the student was receiving in the previous district until the ARC can meet and make the appropriate changes. Remember, once the student is enrolled in your district, you are now responsible for the decisions made. It's important to review all previous information, collect any needed data, conduct assessments if needed, and make the appropriate decisions for the student. Out-of-state transfer students. If a child with a disability transfers between school districts within the same academic year from outside the state and had an IEP in effect in another state, then the child shall be provided FAPE comparable to that described in the IEP until the local education agency conducts an evaluation if it's determined necessary. Also, the ARC will help develop, adopt, and implement a new IEP if the child meets the eligibility criteria as defined in Kentucky regulations. In essence, if a student from out of state enrolls in a Kentucky district with a current IEP, the district must provide a free appropriate public education with comparable services, just like an in-state transfer. However, the ARC must determine Kentucky eligibility. The eligibility requirements for certain categories differ from state to state. The ARC must treat this as an initial evaluation unless previously identified in Kentucky and adhere to the 60 school day timeline. If a student enrolls in a Kentucky district with a current IEP, the district must implement that IEP to the maximum extent possible. Kentucky eligibility must be determined, and the ARC must review all documentation to determine what evaluation information must be gathered. This concludes the module.